Imagine you smoke weed every other day. It's legal in your state. You've never hurt anybody, never pointed a gun at anybody, never even been in trouble with the law. But because you also happen to own a Glock 9mm that you keep in your home for self-defense, the federal government says you are now a felon. Not because you did anything with that gun, not because you were high while holding it, just because you use marijuana and you also own a firearm. That's it. That's the entire crime. And if convicted, you're not looking at a fine or a slap on the wrist. You're looking at up to 15 years in federal prison. Now, that is not a hypothetical. That is exactly what happened to a man in Texas, and it is exactly the case that just went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, where the justices issued a 9-0 unanimous decision that affects millions of Americans across this entire country. So today we're breaking down this brand new Supreme Court ruling, what it actually says, who it protects, who it does not protect, and why both gun rights groups and the ACLU are celebrating this decision for very different reasons. So let's get into it. Before we break this down, if you appreciate this type of content and you want to make sure you never miss a video when a major ruling like this comes down, go ahead and hit subscribe and tap that notification bell. I break these cases down as they happen, so you're not relying on some talking head on cable news to tell you what your rights actually are. Okay, so let's rewind and talk about how we even got here, because the facts of this case matter a lot to understanding why the court ruled the way it did. This case centers around a man named Ali Hamani, a Texas resident. Hamani openly admitted that he used marijuana roughly every other day. Now remember, marijuana is legal in a majority of states in some form at this point. Over 40 states have legalized it in some capacity, whether medical, recreational, or both. But here's the catch that a lot of people don't realize. Even in states where marijuana is completely legal, it is still classified as a Schedule I controlled substance under federal law. And under federal law, specifically a statute known as 18 U.S.C. Section 922, subsection G3, it is a federal crime for what the law calls an unlawful user of a controlled substance to possess a firearm. So Hamani, who kept a Glock 9mm pistol in his home, was federally prosecuted under this law. Now here's what's important. He was not intoxicated at the time he was found with the firearm. He was not physically holding the weapon when he was arrested. There was no allegation that he had ever threatened anyone, hurt anyone, or acted dangerously with that firearm in any way. The entire basis of the prosecution was simply this: he uses marijuana regularly, and he also owns a gun. And federal law says those two things together equal a felony. Now, think about how sweeping that theory of prosecution really is when you sit with it for a second. Under the government's original position in this case, it did not matter whether Hamani had ever been drunk or high with that gun in his hand. It did not matter whether he had a violent criminal record. It did not matter whether a single neighbor, family member, or law enforcement officer had ever expressed a shred of concern about his behavior around firearms. The government's argument was essentially a status-based argument, meaning the mere status of being a regular marijuana user was, by itself, sufficient grounds to strip away a constitutionally protected right and expose someone to over a decade behind bars. That is the theory the Supreme Court was being asked to bless. And that theory is exactly what all 9 justices ultimately rejected. Now, a federal appeals court looked at this case first and tossed out the indictment against Hamani, ruling that as applied to him specifically, this federal gun ban was unconstitutional. The government did not just let that go. The Department of Justice appealed, and this case made its way all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States, where it was argued and ultimately decided this term. So now let's talk about what the Supreme Court actually said, because this is where it gets really important for gun owners across the country to understand. Justice Neil Gorsuch wrote the opinion for the court, and remember, this was not some narrow 5-4 split down ideological lines. This was 9-0. Every single justice, liberal and conservative alike, agreed on the outcome here. Gorsuch's opinion made clear that the government cannot simply assume that someone is dangerous just because they use an illegal substance and also own a firearm. In the court's own words, sometimes unlawful drug use might render a person dangerous, but the government in this case never even tried to prove that Hamani specifically was dangerous. They were relying entirely on a blanket assumption, essentially saying that anyone who uses marijuana, no matter how infrequently, no matter how peacefully, automatically forfeits their Second Amendment rights. And the court said that kind of broad, categorical assumption, without any actual showing of dangerousness, risks letting the government basically swallow the Second Amendment whole. If simply belonging to a broad category of people, in this case marijuana users, is enough to strip away a constitutional right, then the government could theoretically do that to almost any group it wanted to target next. So the court ruled that, as applied to Hamani, this federal gun ban violated his Second Amendment rights. Now, why does it matter so much that this framework requires individualized proof rather than a blanket assumption. Because this is really the crux of modern Second Amendment law right now. Over the last several years, the court has been building out a test that asks whether the government's justification for a firearm restriction fits within this country's historical tradition of firearm regulation. Under that framework, laws that disarm people based on individualized findings, things like domestic violence restraining orders, felony convictions for violent crimes, or adjudications of mental illness that make someone a danger, tend to survive scrutiny because those have real historical analogs and they rely on specific individualized findings about that particular person. But laws that try to disarm an entire broad category of people based on nothing more than a generalized assumption with no individualized showing required run into serious trouble under this framework. And that is exactly the box that the drug user gun ban fell into as it was being applied here. The government wasn't pointing to anything specific about Himani. It was pointing to a category and saying membership in this category alone is enough. This also ties into arguments that gun rights advocates have been making for years now, essentially warning that if the government could disqualify an entire class of law-abiding citizens from Second Amendment protection just by asserting, without proof, that the class is dangerous, there would be no natural stopping point. Could the government then argue that people who drink alcohol regularly are presumptively dangerous and disqualify them too? Could it target people based on other lawful but disfavored behaviors? The court's ruling here essentially closes that door, at least with respect to this particular law and these particular facts, by requiring the government to show its work rather than relying on assumption alone. Now, I want to pause here and make something extremely clear because there's already a lot of confusion online about what this ruling does and does not do. This is not a ruling that says anyone who has ever used marijuana can now go buy a gun with zero consequences ever. Gorsuch was very deliberate in saying that this opinion is narrow. The ruling does not touch other parts of that same federal law. It does not affect the ban on gun ownership for people who are drug addicts, meaning someone with a pattern of habitual chronic abuse. It does not affect the ban on possessing a firearm while you are presently intoxicated. And it does not affect the prohibition on firearms for people who have been legally determined to be a danger to themselves or to others. In fact, the opinion specifically pointed out that this ruling would not have protected someone like Hunter Biden, who was prosecuted under this exact same statute, because in that case, there was an admission of chronic drug addiction, not just casual or occasional use. So the distinction the court drew here is really important. This ruling protects the millions of Americans who use marijuana occasionally or regularly, but are not addicts, are not intoxicated at the time they possess a firearm, and have not been shown to be dangerous. It does not blow open the door for felons, addicts, or people adjudicated as dangerous to suddenly have unrestricted gun rights. Now let's talk about why this matters on a nationwide scale, because the title of this video isn't clickbait. This genuinely does affect a massive number of Americans. The Justice Department itself has admitted that it prosecutes roughly 300 cases a year where this exact drug user gun ban is the leading charge. And when you consider that nearly half of all Americans report having used marijuana at some point in their lives, and you consider that gun ownership in this country numbers in the tens of millions, the overlap between those two groups is enormous. This ruling directly impacts anyone who lawfully owns a firearm in a state where marijuana is legal, but who could have previously been federally prosecuted simply for also being a marijuana user. So let's talk about the reaction to this ruling, because this is honestly one of the more interesting parts of this story. You would expect a Second Amendment case like this to break down along predictable political lines, right? Gun rights groups cheering, gun control groups upset. But that's not really what happened here. The National Rifle Association came out and praised this decision, calling it a major victory for the Second Amendment and for peaceable gun owners across the country. Their position has always been that nobody should lose a fundamental constitutional right simply for engaging in nonviolent, peaceful conduct, and they argued there was never any historical justification for a categorical ban like this one. But here's the part that might surprise you. The American Civil Liberties Union also praised this ruling. The ACLU's legal director came out and said that this decision makes clear the government cannot criminalize gun ownership simply because someone uses marijuana, and that with so many Americans having used marijuana at some point, this ruling protects the rights of millions of people from what she called arbitrary and discriminatory enforcement. She specifically noted that the court sent a strong message that the government cannot criminalize an entire category of people based on unfounded categorical assumptions about their dangerousness. So think about that for a second. You've got the NRA and the ACLU, two organizations that do not agree on much when it comes to firearms policy, both looking at this ruling and calling it a win. That right there should tell you how significant this decision actually is. And honestly, when you step back and think about it, it kind of makes sense that both sides found something to like here, even if their reasons for liking it are completely different. The NRA is looking at this purely through the lens of the Second Amendment. To them, this is a straightforward win for gun rights. Full stop. A recognition that peaceable, non-violent conduct should never be the basis for stripping someone of a constitutional right. The ACLU, on the other hand, is looking at this through more of a civil liberties and due process lens. Their concern isn't really about guns specifically, it's about the broader principle that the government should not be allowed to punish entire categories of people based on generalized assumptions rather than individualized evidence. That's a due process concern as much as it is a Second Amendment concern, and it's the kind of principle the ACLU has fought for in plenty of contexts that have nothing to do with firearms at all. So even though these two organizations arrived at their support from completely different philosophical starting points, they landed in the exact same place on this particular ruling. It's also worth mentioning that legal commentators across the political spectrum have pointed out just how rare it is to see a case like this go 9-0. Most closely watched Second Amendment cases in recent years have split along predictable lines, 5-4 or 6-3, with the more conservative justices siding with gun rights and the more liberal justices siding with the government's ability to regulate. The fact that every single justice on this current court, appointed by presidents from both parties, agreed on this outcome tells you that this wasn't really a close call from a legal standpoint, even if the underlying politics of guns and drugs are still hotly contested in this country. Now, not everybody was thrilled. Gun safety advocacy groups, including an organization called Brady, which had actually sided with the government in this case arguing against rolling back the drug user gun ban, put out a statement afterward trying to downplay how far this ruling reaches. Their argument was that while the court struck down the law as applied to this one specific individual, Hamani, the court did not strike down the government's broader authority to restrict firearms access for certain categories of people. In other words, the gun control side is trying to frame this as a narrow, individualized loss rather than a broad, sweeping victory for gun rights. And to be fair to them, legally speaking, that is technically accurate. This was an as-applied challenge, meaning the court ruled the law was unconstitutional as it was applied to him and his specific circumstances, not that the entire statute is unconstitutional on its face for every single person in every single situation. But here's why that distinction, while legally real, may end up being much less significant in practice than gun control advocates want it to be. Once the Supreme Court lays out the reasoning here, unanimously mind you, with all 9 justices agreeing that the government cannot rely on a blanket assumption of dangerousness without actually proving dangerousness in the individual case, that reasoning becomes a roadmap. It becomes the framework that every single federal prosecutor and every single defense attorney across this entire country now has to work with. Any future prosecution under this statute against anyone in a similar situation to Hemeny, someone who uses marijuana but wasn't intoxicated, wasn't dangerous, and doesn't have a pattern of chronic abuse, is now going to run headfirst into this ruling. Defense attorneys everywhere are already going to be citing this case in courtrooms across the country. So even though technically the court didn't strike the whole law down on its face, the practical effect nationwide is going to be enormous. Now let's talk about what this means going forward, because there are still a lot of open questions here. The court did not tell us exactly where the line is between someone who is simply an unlawful user in a casual sense versus someone whose drug use rises to the level of habitual abuse or addiction that would still justify the ban. That line is going to have to get sorted out case by case in courtrooms across the country over the coming months and years. We're likely going to see federal prosecutors trying to draw distinctions, arguing that certain defendants are more like Hunter Biden, a chronic addict, and less like Hemeny, an occasional user. And we're going to see defense attorneys pushing back, using this ruling to argue that their clients fall on the protected side of that line. We're also very likely to see additional litigation testing the boundaries of this decision. Remember, this is exactly the kind of ruling that tends to generate a wave of follow-up cases, because now that the Supreme Court has said the government cannot rely on categorical assumptions without individualized proof of dangerousness, defense attorneys across the country are going to start challenging other categories under this same law using this exact same reasoning. So don't be surprised if, over the next year or two, we start seeing more of these cases work their way up through the federal court system, and potentially some of them making their way back to the Supreme Court to further clarify exactly how far this ruling extends. There's also a bigger picture point here worth mentioning. This ruling fits into a larger pattern we've been seeing out of the Supreme Court over the last several years, where the court has increasingly required the government to justify firearm restrictions using historical analysis, essentially asking whether a modern gun restriction has some kind of analog or tradition rooted in the history of this country at the time the Second Amendment and 14th Amendment were adopted. That framework has been reshaping Second Amendment litigation across the entire country, and this marijuana case is really just the latest chapter in that ongoing story. So if you've you've been paying attention to gun rights cases over the past few years, this ruling should not come as a total shock. It's very much in line with where the court has been heading. Let's also talk practically for a second about what this means for the tens of millions of Americans who fall into this exact overlap. People who use marijuana lawfully under their state's laws and who also lawfully own firearms. Before this ruling, that overlap existed in a genuinely dangerous legal gray zone. Even though your state might tell you it's perfectly fine to use marijuana, and even though your state might tell you it's perfectly fine to own that Glock or that shotgun or that hunting rifle, federal law was sitting there in the background, saying that doing both at the same time could land you in federal prison for up to 15 years. That is an enormous amount of legal risk hanging over an enormous number of ordinary, law-abiding people. And most of them probably had no idea that risk even existed. A lot of people assume that because their state legalized marijuana, the issue is settled. This case is a pretty stark reminder that state legalization and federal law are two completely separate tracks, and they don't automatically align just because your state passed a ballot measure. What this ruling does is meaningfully shrink that gray zone, at least for the portion of that population that isn't a chronic addict, wasn't intoxicated at the time, and hasn't been found dangerous. But I want to be honest with you all, it does not eliminate the gray zone entirely. There is still a federal form, the ATF Form 4473, that every single person fills out when they purchase a firearm from a licensed dealer. And that form still asks directly whether you are an unlawful user of a controlled substance, including marijuana, even in states where it's legal. Lying on that form is still a separate federal crime, regardless of this ruling. So gun owners who use marijuana still need to be extremely careful about how they answer that question, because this ruling addressed prosecution under the possession ban itself. It did not rewrite the federal firearm purchase paperwork or eliminate the separate crime of falsifying that form. One more thing worth flagging before we wrap up, because I think it's genuinely interesting and it doesn't get talked about enough. This ruling arrives at a moment where the tension between state marijuana legalization and federal prohibition has been building for years, with basically no resolution from Congress. Lawmakers have introduced bill after bill to try to reconcile federal law with the reality that most states have now legalized marijuana in some form, and none of those bills have made it across the finish line. So instead of the political branches sorting this out through legislation, it's once again fallen to the courts to draw these lines case by case on a piecemeal basis. That's not necessarily a criticism of the court. The justices are simply doing their job of interpreting the Constitution as it applies to the case in front of them, but it does mean that gun owners in this country are, once again, left relying on judicial interpretation rather than clear, comprehensive guidance from Congress about how these two conflicting bodies of law are supposed to coexist. Until Congress actually acts, and there's no strong indication that's happening anytime soon, expect more of these cases to keep working their way through the federal court system. So here's the bottom line, and I want to make sure this is crystal clear before we wrap up. If you are a marijuana user who legally owns a firearm and you have never been adjudicated as dangerous, you are not a chronic drug addict under the legal definition, and you were not intoxicated at the time you possessed that firearm, this ruling is a significant, meaningful protection for you. It does not mean you're completely in the clear in every possible scenario, and it absolutely does not mean this issue is fully settled, because as we just talked about, there are still gray areas that are going to get litigated for years to come. But what it does mean is that the federal government can no longer simply assume you're dangerous and prosecute you for up to 15 years in prison just because you fall into a broad category. They now have to actually justify that assumption, and after this ruling, that is going to be a much, much harder bar for federal prosecutors to clear. This is a case I'm going to continue following closely because, as I mentioned, there is almost certainly more litigation coming that will further define exactly where these lines get drawn. As more developments come out of this, I will absolutely keep you guys updated. So if you want to make sure you don't miss those updates or any of the other cases we cover on this channel, make sure you like this video, drop a comment letting me know what you think about this ruling, and subscribe with that notification bell turned on so you never miss it when we break down a case like this.